Keep the Acid Horizon podcast ad-free by subscribing to our Patreon. Welcome to Acid Horizon, the theory podcast. When we were setting up our episodes for 2025, our slate, as it were, we wanted our dominant focuses to be analyses and criticisms of the new right and the surge of reactionary politics around the globe. But one thing that we didn't want to miss was how this perennial intensification of economic and social alienation brings to bear on the mental health of people, especially those who are often the target of reactionary propaganda, men. So, in recent years, we've heard of this phenomenon called the male loneliness epidemic, which, if you look at the numbers, it's not only men who are suffering the effects of feeling dislodged from the present and a general decrease in friendships. But it is also true that this research shows a staggering disparity that men of today suffer an overwhelmingly increased sense of alienation and diminished personal relationships, and it has various health impacts as well. And I'll just mention a few of these. There was a study put out by the Surgeon General of the United States in 2023, and I couldn't find very much recent. It seems like this is when the big aggregation of data occurred. There is research to suggest that only 30% of men say that they have had a private conversation with a friend in the past week in which they shared their personal feelings about anything. The Surgeon General also says that there's a greater risk of cardiovascular disease, dementia, stroke, depression, anxiety, and premature death associated with the effects of loneliness. And one of the interesting statistics that stuck out to me was that a lack of social connection raises a person's risk for premature death in the same manner that the equivalent of smoking as many as 15 cigarettes a day would. So, rather than smoking a pack of American spirits, you can actually smoke the spirit of America, which is the alienation itself, folks. And this is what we're going to talk about here today, is the hegemonic masculinity that men suffer around the world, how it connects with our political realities, and so forth. And today we have brought back our friend and returning guest, Chuck LeBlanc, to delve into his research and insights into hegemonic masculinity and the challenge that men face in terms of embracing their vulnerability. Chuck, in addition to being a licensed clinical therapist, is also the host of a podcast called Couch to Couch, where he takes up various topics related to his discipline. And with Chuck in the studio today, hopefully we can get a better grasp of some of the challenges men are facing today and what people like Chuck have been doing about it. Chuck, welcome back to Acid Horizon.
I'm excited to be here. I mean, you all know how much I love this fucking podcast and how helpful it's been. You all have been, well, I said this last time, I think I freaked Will out about that when I said you've been a huge influence on how I practice as a therapist and how I understand things like, well, all things Deleuze and Guattari, but many other things other than Hegel, because I can't fucking stand him. That one's for you, Adam. But we can get into that another time. But it's great to be back.
Great. And you sent us a PowerPoint for a conference that you recently attended called, well, the name of the paper or presentation that you sent us was called Embracing Vulnerability. And I don't have the subtitle here. It has something to do with hegemonic masculinity. But could you talk about the impetus for this particular research and what is the sort of general focus of the presentation itself?
So where was this, 2023, I got the opportunity to send in a proposal with the CCPA, which is the Canadian Counseling and Psychotherapy Association of Canada. They were doing a conference. They do one every year. And I had been working with Deleuze and Guattari, and I've been working as a therapist at that point for 3 years. And I said to myself, well, I've been doing this with people. I've been researching ongoing quite a bit, and I'm getting some results, and I'm seeing a couple of things. Why don't I whip a paper together that kind of talks about what I'm seeing and what I'm doing and see if I get laughed out of the room or if anybody even shows up. And that will help me figure out if I'm like onto something other than the clinical results I was seeing. So I put this paper together that talks about, so the impetus behind the paper was actually about the technique I was using. But because I work with men specifically, my experience with the technique I was using was through the eyes of the masculine lens or whatever you want to call that, psyche. The technique specifically had a lot to do with Eugene Genlin, which we'll talk about, and James Hillman, influenced by you. And there's a history behind that. But what I wanted to do is try to see if I can get this conference together where I can get enough therapists in the room to try out this technique to see what that would be like. And specifically what I was attempting to do, or what I would do with clients, is you're dealing with men who are in various stages of being like locked into the male ideal, which is blocking them from, and this is where the vulnerability comes in, blocking them from a type of connective emotional expression. So connective internally and externally emotional expression. There's something blocking it. And what I was finding, tipped off by specifically Deleuze and Guattari, because I wouldn't have thought about this outside of that. So if 10 years ago me wouldn't have seen this, now I kind of see it, is the social influence of kind of the maleness that people are expressing. So kind of like the Stoic ideal, kind of like specifically vulnerability was the big one. So very reserved. And you see this a lot if you open up, if you have an M in your name in Instagram and you go on a reel, you're eventually going to see like a Stoic quote show up some fucking place about how we need to be reserved, control our emotions, and take the storms as they come, so to speak. So a lot of this technique specifically was designed to try to figure out how can I help someone who's stuck in what I call the hegemonic masculine archetypes connect internally and externally with their emotions and what is getting in the way. So that's kind of what that's all about.
I'm sure you see all kinds of experiences inside the room where you do therapy. What would you say is a kind of dominant narrative between all age groups, whether it be teenagers, young adult men, men in their middle age, elderly men, a thread that traverses various senses of masculinity over the lifeline?
One in particular that always comes up, always eventually will come up, is this concept of self-sufficiency and providerness, if you put them together, right? So becoming a self-sufficient provider, so they have to be independent, they have to be able to hold their own weight, do things themselves, and be the stable environment for their family. That's the biggest, the most common, I would say, thread that comes out that we deal with a lot and that we kind of try to go after. I guess D&G would call that the conjunctive synthesis, I think. And so we try to wiggle our way through that to figure out what's going on the inside of that. Is that influence from the outside or the inside? But the biggest one would be those two personality types mixed together.
In terms of these, I think it's really central to think about this provider archetype, because it is so historically prevalent anyway. It predates capitalism in the earliest forms of, I guess, what we can call sort of very men-centered patriarchal sort of social arrangements and forms of kinship. And what I think is interesting is in terms of the idea of providing. Ultimately, it does seem like it's going to be in conflict with the idea of being reserved, not being vulnerable. Because in order to provide for someone, you're offering them something. Of course, it's very much stratified within patriarchal social relations, but it's kind of a publicization of a man's self as being offering, like, I am a provider, I can provide. Obviously, materially, this isn't possible anymore because there's one income households, far less of them ever. People don't want to get into those kind of relationships, and so some men who might be socialized into expecting those will be arguably quite rightfully disappointed by them. But it seems like do you think that the reservation aspect and the provider aspect can come into tension? Because there's one line I always think about when it comes to anything therapeutic, which is a line that I learned in my own psychoanalysis, which is a line from Donald Winnicott, which is, it is a joy to be hidden and a disaster not to be found. And I think that really does epitomize a certain type of loneliness where the reservation, the holding of oneself back from the world, is hiding one's vulnerabilities. Are obviously there, but at the same time, hoping that someone finds us so we can provide for them in that sort of typical sense. Do you think those aspects really do come into conflict? Is there really like a tension or a double bind at the heart of this?
I would say, and I think the double bind, I love that quote by Winnicott, by the way. The double bind is the problem because we're looking to connect, which is why we get together. And we build those connections. There's emotional connections. There's intimacy. There's all these like impulses, like warmth impulses. If you think of, I use analogy with flowers and sun a lot to that, those intensities that people are drawn to. But when you have this provider and mentality, then you have to be the stable one. You have to hold people up. You have to be the strong one. These are all like the the things you can put on a t-shirt for this sort of mentality. And with the reserved nature, the reserve is like, I think part of being reserved when you're trying to be strong is that you don't want to seem weak in any way. Like you can't hold people up. You can't provide. Atlas does want to take a knee every once in a while, right? But if you show that, then the whole structure falls down. Because if you show any sort of weakness in terms of vulnerability, if you show that you're hurt, for instance, in this landscape of mental health, sadness, hurt, grieving, disappointment, those emotions or affects in particular are the things that are held on reserve. Right. And then you have secondary emotions that show up. And for men, it's the emotions we're socialized to be allowed to have, to be expressed, which is anger, irritation, and frustration. And so this disconnect between the two doesn't allow you to connect at all. So then your connection is through, like you said, providing. So now it's a performance system rather than a bonding system.
Yeah, the performance is still mandatory, but all of the stage has been completely stripped out and destroyed for both good and ill. Sorry, Craig.
No, that's fine. One of the things that stood out right away to me in the presentation was this use of the term limited emotional vocabulary. And so I'm imagining that you have clients who go into your office and you're listening for words, phrases, habits of language that identify some of what you're talking about, this demand for personal performance, the language of inadequacy, perhaps. And what is it specifically that you are listening for? What is it that you hear? And I know there's therapy modalities like CBT, which are very intentional about constructing different kinds of statements that we make in reaction to various emotional states. I'm wondering if that's an approach that you take in context of the therapy that you do.
It's interesting. When you had me on the first time, I would have said yes. I'm coming in and I'm looking for certain things, right? And you start off with like a presenting problem. The client comes in, says, this is the issue. And then back then I was trying to be as like a Carl Rogers as possible and just like absorb what's happening and try to build it together. But what I'm looking for is certain words that indicate what's happening. Like affective words that indicate depression, affective words that indicate sadness, affective words that indicate the desire for strength. But now what I'm trying to do and have for a couple of years is trying to figure out when they come in with the presenting problem, how are they trying to express that problem? So like when they tell me I want to be strong, let's say like I'm supposed to be stronger than this, then I want to hear that, but then I want to see it. So in their body, you can see them like deflate or tense up or cry, right? And what's happening is they're having this affective situation. I say like the intensity of the room got them for that moment. And now it's coming out. So all of this is to try to co-create the definition of what's going on. So the limited emotional vocabulary speaks a lot to looking to figure out if they can express what's going on for them, one, looking to see how they articulate it, verbally, physically, and all that kind of thing. Tone, all that juicy bits, which we love. But then looking for the limitations of that. Like how far can they take that? And then what would we need to do to push them further to that? So before you have things like an emotional wheel, like this picture, and you're like, so and I fucking hated that thing. But I didn't know how else to do it. So my first, I would say year, I would be like, okay, I'm dealing with a client, let's say, who's anhedonic. So all of their expressions of their emotions is gone. They have no access to it. And it seems more than just a freeze response. And so I would pull out the wheel and we'd look, and let's say it's like sadness. And then we'd start to figure out how would somebody feel sad and try to work our way backwards to figure it out. There was some success there, but it felt a little bit like leading the witness, like I wasn't really getting to know them. So now it's more about trying to work together to articulate what's happening, whether an affect shows up or not. But we have so much more information, like the body, like the affects, and like the social field. So when you say this, what happened? Like, what did the clerk say? How did they react? Even if it's confusing, there's so much more to bring in. So that particular way of looking at it is so that they can, and we can co-create the definition of whatever emotion is happening.
I mean, Chuck, in your experience, actually, just talking about hedonia, do you think that in your experience that things are weighted more on the side of depressive anhedonia when you have clients who are men who are having complaints of particularly something like loneliness or sort of an existential sort of loss? Because I do wonder on occasion whether the current models, whether they predispose us more towards thinking about things in terms of depressive anhedonia, or what I want to speak about, which is Mark Fisher's idea of depressive hedonia, the idea that we have nothing to seek, but we cannot do anything but seek pleasure, which is, of course, way easier if you could just be locked in with your phones and illegal weed and the like, or just with a few beers. And there's a phrase I keep hearing about from like various kind of addiction counselling manuals and the like, which says that the opposite of addiction is connection. And if there's any sort of truth to that, I think it's interesting because I think, in a way, using sort of substances and staying in all the time, in a way, it's that sort of there's a kind of hedonia that is also a kind of hiding in a similar ways as the Winnicott, as is talking about, of not putting yourself out there. You can just fill the void in that way. I mean, how does, in your experience, how has pleasure and maybe even some things like addiction or at least substance use fit into this whole matrix of mental health as you currently see it?
Yeah. So the way I see that is adaptation. So what has happened? So let's say addiction to a phone. Let's just go that direction. So what has happened in our life to guide us towards this form of adaptation? Sometimes it's running away. Sometimes it's running towards. I'm currently working for the past couple of months to try to understand more of like desire as production. So I'm using that language a lot more now. So you guys can help me out with that. This is very fresh. In trying to now understand, okay, if I have a client who's addicted, well, okay, what is this addiction providing? Like, what is it providing? So one of the first things in my opinion, and I think it's a lot of therapists' opinion now, is to not look at what's happening for a client as good or bad. Like, take the judgment out of it entirely and try to get to know what's happening in itself. So what is it providing, right? And now I'm starting to look at it as, okay, well, what are you trying, like, what is your desire trying to produce when you're going for this in each instance? So trying to see it as a present, like Gestalt, if you think of Gestalt therapy, present moment situation. So we know the history of it, and the history has certain like vibratory, like DNA to it, which can tell us a lot about the adaptation, can give us a lot of information like reading a book, but you want to focus more on like what's happening right in front of me right now. So I was just having a conversation with you and you pulled your phone out. Awesome, right? What happened in this exact moment that caused that reaction? When you find it, sometimes it's a survival adaptation, sometimes it isn't, like it's depending on the person. Then you have an environment, you have something to play with, to start to like discuss, to play with, whether it's physical or not. I do a lot of physical work, like Gestalt work now, to see what they want to do with that, if you can get at the heart of what it's producing. So sometimes when I see like social media addiction, there is a sense of emotional overwhelm going on, whether it's task-oriented, pressure-oriented, social pressure-oriented, internal, external. So what this particular movement is doing is trying to like take the load off, right? Their limbic system is dysregulated because of the pressure, because of whatever. So what it's seeking is this like deep breath. So then we get to play with that deep breath, not the social media addiction, because that's just like what they're doing. It's not what's being produced. Then we get to play with that.
Speaking of social media, I don't know if you heard our most recent episode with Richard Seymour, Chuck.
No, when did that?
Oh, it came out. Well,
Yet.
what was it? Monday, Sunday? We put it out.
Oh, not yet.
Anyway, one of the things that we talk about at length in that particular episode is the various expressions of male alienation that we see, and especially the attachment of young men to particular figures on social media, like Andrew Tate, for example. And, and young men in particular seem to face this overwhelming bricolage of fragmented masculinity that's kind of put together in various parts. You have this reclamation of an ancient or classical form of masculinity in the figure of Stoicism and, the Greek statue profile picture accounts that we see online. But then there's also like the Andrew Tate variety of things. And it seems as if, to find something like emotional vulnerability or locating one's capacity for intimacy, one must, first of all, overcome the hormonal aspect of being somebody in puberty, but then also the sort of morass of semiotic garbage that's out there to even get to a place where you could find yourself in that way. In the therapeutic context, do you see any of this stuff come up? Are young men in particular coming in with ideas that directly echo things that you're hearing or seeing on social media?
Yes. And oh my God. So there's probably no person, and I'll go on the record to say this, that I loathe more than Andrew Tate and Jordan fucking Peterson. And every time I think of the episode, Adam, where you were like spitting, trying to say Tony Blair, that's what I think of when I think of Jordan Peterson. But anyway, but I have to say, to their credit, it made me quite a successful therapist, because people saw this insane bullshit and then came to me, who had to like undo the insane bullshit with a lot of success, because what you're looking for is there's two things I think what people are looking for. And there's more, but two things that I focus on. One is an identity, looking for an identity and a mentor, right? Something that I call an anchor, something to anchor the self in, so then you know where to go. Because I think in our society, and I don't know why this is happening over the past couple of years, you both would be much better at explaining this to me than I would. But over the past, I would say, decade, this concept of the self as multitudinous has like really gone out there. And I think people understand that a lot more than they say they do. And that has created a lot of existential dread. And I think on top of that, because of the economic playing field that we're all in over the past 10, 20 years, parents are a lot more overworked. So there's a lot less like access to mentors. So now you have young men going out there seeing idols and anchors that they could possibly be, but not a lot of attention paid to them. Mm-hmm. Right? Because I mean, my own dad is like one of my heroes, love the man, but he worked like 75, 80 hours a week growing up. Right. And I had like, he somehow managed to always be there, which I now know was absolutely insane, and how he's still alive is a miracle. But I was lucky in my friend groups to have access to my dad that I did. Enough influential access to kind of take some of his personality on. That's not the norm, right? And so you're having a lot of people coming in seeking mentor and an anchor of how to be, right? While being bombarded on the outside, socialized into types of males to be, but having very little direct physical experience of it. So then you're just lost, and we're all lost as teenagers. The teenage years, I don't know about you two, but it fucking sucked. If I ever got a pill that would made me reborn, I would like skip that and jump to 21. But that's a really like fucked up time, because you're a kid becoming an adult, but still a kid. So there's a lot of mess that happens then, dealing with identity. So then they run straight into those two fucking nutheads, and who are only making their money because they can do this. So now they get to say whatever crazy shit they want. Because people are hearing them, they get a lot of money. So they're reinforcing these concepts of masculinity that are just wicked damaging. And it's terrible. As you can see, I have a lot of rage when it comes to that.
Yeah.
But to answer the question, yes, I hear it all the time, see it all the time. It's tapered off the past 2 years, I will say that. But I have had sessions with people who are just quoting these people and trying to make sense of them. And that's why they came in, and having to deal with that was a wild time.
Hey everyone, this is Craig, and this is the spot in the podcast where ads would normally go, but Acid Horizon does not want to use outside advertisers to support our endeavor. So why don't you subscribe to our Patreon account? In fact, beginning this month on February 16th, 2025, we will start our newest reading group, which is Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, led by our own Adam C. Jones. If you want more of Deleuze and Guattari, hop into our already ongoing The Anti-Oedipus Files reading group. We are just getting started. Our goal as a podcast has been to bring thoughtful discussion and philosophy to as many ears as possible, and do so in a way that allows us to keep it going. And one way that you can help us ensure that we continue our mission is by subscribing to our Patreon and joining our reading groups for only $5 a month. Adam is a recent PhD graduate. I have multiple graduate degrees in philosophy and education, and Will is on his way to earning his PhD as well. So please come study with us. In fact, if you want to have a more intensive study experience, check out the new Luminary Patreon tier on our Patreon account. Or you can take one of the multiple classes with Acid Horizon at the new Center for Social Research coming this summer. Currently, you can register for the class Creativity and Intoxication, led by our own Adam C. Jones. So navigate to the show notes, subscribe to our Patreon, and check out Adam's class at the new center. All right, let's get back to the discussion. You know, it's interesting. I mean, you're in the same age group as me. Mm-hmm. And so we have the benefit of being able to look back at our adolescence from a certain vantage point. I mean, Adam's actually not that far away either. One thing that I do see from that time, and maybe like me, my dad worked quite a bit and, you know, couldn't be as involved maybe as some other parents because of how much he worked. And I would say that prompted me to seek mentors and things like that. And I was just an odd lot anyway. And so I was looking for something different. And I'm kind of glad that we didn't have that stuff back then, Jordan Peterson and Andrew Tate, because, you know, it would have been a minefield for somebody like me. And looking back, I probably didn't make all of the correct choices in terms of people that I chose as mentors. It raises the question for me because I have two different sets of experiences which socialized me just as a person in general, not anything gendered specifically. But I will say the mentor aspect seemed the more gendered aspect. And so like when I was looking for somebody to be a martial arts teacher or something like that, I wanted to effectuate the kind of power that I believe that I didn't have. You know, a sense of lack, a sense of inadequacy kind of loomed large over me. But then there were times where I got involved in social circles like theater, for example. But not only that, I was also involved with this kind of like quasi-political theatrical group where we did do a little bit of kumbaya, a little bit of share and care. And it was in those times where that hunger and yearning for a particular sense of solidity and identity dissipated, at least in the context of that group. And I would say if I didn't have that, I probably wouldn't have what would now be the sort of footprint or foundation of the politics that I have now, or at least the capacity to have expanded my political lens as large as I was able to. Of course, then going to college and reading books and so forth kind of took over that role. But not having had those incipient experiences where like there was something very specific that I had undergone. And maybe I mentioned this in a particular episode at one time. My 8th grade biology teacher picked me out because I was into Rush Limbaugh and conservative politics and that kind of shit when I was younger, you know? Like I thought that was cool. And she was clearly a liberal, but she picked me out. She's like, hey, I want you to go try and do this like little conference. You're into theater, go check this out. And it was in that moment I started learning about the problems of the environment. And we started talking about things that affected us locally. And we did this kind of across cities and across the landscapes. Like we had people of all races. We had people from urban environments. We had people from rural environments, all getting together in a room and sharing in a certain way that felt very, for lack of a better term, collective. Mm-hmm. And it was in those few short days, and this whole seminar or whatever took place at a community college, and it lasted 3 or 4 days, and it culminated in creating a performance then that we took on the road, and we went to like various institution and Kiwanis clubs and all sorts of things to like put on this presentation. And I remember during that time, the irony of it all, I had in-school suspension. So when I went to the community college to participate in the workshop, when I got back to school, I had to sit in in-school suspension for something I did, missing Saturday detentions or something like that. But those few short days had such a profound impact against the quantitatively overwhelming pressure of being a man. And that was a kind of rupture that then, like I said, created an opening for something else. It makes me think then that sometimes even the pressures that we feel connected to finding one's identity comes as a result of not having these collective interventions. And I reflect on that a lot. And that lies in the bedrock of my political commitments.
Yeah, it sounds like an incredibly powerful one. And as you were talking, I was trying to reflect on like, I say this a lot, but like, how the hell did I become me? Like, how did we get here? How the fuck did we get here? And, for most of my teenage years, I was basically a nomad, like transient, didn't have a spot, had very little friends, floated in and out, and it was all lost constantly. The overwhelming feeling was lost. Mm-hmm. And that has never gone away, but I have like found myself in like particular communities that have just felt cool, felt great, felt nice, felt in pieces. But when I was in university, it would have been the first time that I started to think seriously about like development, like how, like life, how to life work. I was big into vitalism. That kind of stuff kind of took me. The aspect of vitalism that I loved so much, and this is before I even read like the typical vitalists, and even like years before I found Whitehead and Deleuze and process philosophy, was this concept of like spontaneous adaptation. Like, and I guess you'd call it conatus now. I wish I had that 10 years ago. But it's this concept of like thriving. Like and it all, for me in my 20s, relates to freedom. The concept of freedom. Amartya Sen would call that capability development. The ability to look at the way things are going and see how you want them to go. What are we going to do? Where are we going to go? How are we going to do this? And a lot of my circles when I was younger, my mentors, was like anyone I can get my hands on. Anyone I can get my hands on. And I was lucky enough in my university years to meet Dr. Neville was one. He's an Aristotelian. He was like a stand-up comedian. And the only reason I fell in love with philosophy was because he made it so funny. That's it. I remember sitting in the philosophy class, and I had got into university. I said this last time. It was on a bet. I got in. I expected to fail in 3 months. My girlfriend at the time signed up for all my courses. So I walk into philosophy class. I had no idea what this was at all. And the guy was so damn funny and energetic that I was like, this is it. I can do this for the rest of my life. This is so much fun. And I'm still doing it 20 years later. But that concept of vitalism, the concept of freedom, the concept of development is the running thing this whole time.
I don't ever have a concept of like how the hell I got here. I'm just trying to think. I'm just thinking about because a while ago for a different podcast, Pub Golf Transmission that I do, we did like a thing of analyzing like Andrew Tate and Jordan Peterson and sort of seeing like I was looking at one clip of Tate and he's just talking about essentially what he was doing is that he's talking to a material reality for a lot of people, not only my age but especially more for younger than me, which is at least when I was growing up, there was a narrative of social mobility, like the progressive narrative, the narrative of progression. I'm assuming was still like pretty prevalent, in your folks' time as well. Yeah. Especially like the 90s, and the end of history. Like things are going to keep things have ended, but they're ended in the sense of like there's no opposition to everything getting better all the time now. And what Tate and because maybe people might say, oh, the left doesn't have a positive message for young men today. That might be true. I'm not sure if it is, but Peterson and Tate do not have a positive message for young men. The message they give them is not in the sense of I disagree with the values. I mean, in the sense of they break you to fuck down. They tell you that the world is chaotic. They tell you that you are. I mean, Tate literally says in this clip I watched, he said, "Okay, you're going to be in debt to someone else for life. You're going to be screwed over forever. You're never going to have anything." And the problem is that to some extent that's true, because social mobility as a concept, like, dead. It was alive before. It's dead now. Like, and his whole selling point is you're going to be in debt to someone anyway. You might as well be in debt to me, and I'll make you an exploiter. I'll make you the sort of guy who doesn't care about providing. You'll have enough to provide, but you won't care. You'll just take it. And I think it's, in a way, it's not confronting. It's harder to, you don't really want to go around telling people in a way that, yes, you're never going to, like, this degree is not going to get you a job. It's just not. It's like, you are, but we are mostly in the, the imperial core, superfluous to the economy. Most of our jobs are going to be to spend money, and what job you get depends out of who your parents are, what wealth they have, where it is, and what time. And for most people, that time is over. The social democratic sort of post-war consensus is dead. It's so what they do is they offer people the pleasure of participating in the cruelty that formed them. And I think that's an interesting. It's like a redistribution of the cruelty. It's like, it is a little bit Nietzschean to that extent. Although from Resentiment, it's like, I want my share of the fucking cruelty. If the economy is always going to be cruel, where's my little bit of it? And of course, that is also at the same time inherently alienating, because you don't have anything in common with anyone else other than the fact that you see them as prey.
Yeah, fucking brilliant. That's exactly the problem. It's just resentment, right? Like Andrew Tate's some sort of like Borg queen, and I'm sure you'd love to hear that. Just going around, let's just go around and stab people because we were stabbed. This is fan-fucking-tastic.
I mean, then the question is, you're talking about embracing vulnerability, and especially, as Adam says, times are growing more precarious. The future is lost. And once summertime hits in the Northern Hemisphere and the temperatures go up there, we get new figures like, oh, there's not just 10 years left. There's 5. Well, no, there's 1.5, and it seems like we're on that track. And as Adam is saying, this economy of cruelty seems itself hegemonic, even more so than the masculinity itself. And so my question is, what is the sell for embracing vulnerability, especially when the masculine response is, we need resilience more than ever. You need to know how to take a hit. Times are tough. You got to get tougher. And I'm sure maybe you have clients who come in, perhaps who push back against that somewhat, or at least cite that belief as a barrier to accepting that. Like, how does that sort of play out in the therapy space? And have you had those kinds of confrontations where people were resistant to embracing vulnerability on those grounds?
Yeah, I get paid quite a bit every week to have people push back on that concept. They fucking hate it. And you know what? So do I. We all do. Being vulnerability sucks, right? Because you have to be real in the moment, and you have to be active, just to play on the Nietzsche. Because it's presence. And this is the thing about resentment in any line. Like, we may be living in the end of times. That sucks. So I'm not gonna sit here and be like, no, I just gotta be tough. I'm probably gonna piss myself and then go dance with my daughter. Like, the point of vulnerability to me is present to the internal and external experience, such as it is. You can make choices on how you want to adapt in it, adapt out of it, adapt towards it. But vulnerability is being present. So I'll use like a very real, practical analogy here, not analogy, scenario. You're going to therapy because, you know what? You can't communicate. There's like some sort of struggle happening in your relationship. And you can't figure out why. And you can't figure out why, let's say, the intimacy has gone straight down your relationship. And you talk for a while, and we try to piece it together from one perspective, because I only have one person in the room, not the couple. Couples work is hell of a lot more fun, but we can keep that for another episode. And what you figure out is like, okay, well, I'm talking to a man who is reserved around his wife. So they can sense this, and I'll use wife here because that's the most common scenario that I find. They can sense somehow that something's being held back, or they're not being, they feel like they're not being heard, not being received. So they're not being received is a couples counseling way of putting it. And the reason they're not being received is because the reserved nature of the man is stopping him from digesting what his wife is feeling. Not because he's annoyed or because she's yapping or all the shit that people will say and the 90s dads will say on sitcoms. It's because to properly hear what she's saying is to either get hurt, feel inadequate, or grieve or be sad. So I've got to block that shit because that's too painful, but also because I don't have time to cry, be sad, be hurt, because I have to be there for her. So see, the double bind is now showing up. She wants me to be there for her, wants to have this connection, right? I can't be there for her and I can't connect with her because I have to be there for her. It's like, hold on a minute. Now this whole thing is fucked up somehow, right? The dialogue box in the video game, you're pressing the wrong one. So what vulnerability does here is to try to figure out, like, okay, in that moment, so I'll invite the client in and I'll say, okay, take me back, try to play out that moment. What did she say? And they'll tell me, okay? And I know they're telling me this through their receiving context. And then I will say, okay, cool. What was the tone? Replicate the tone. So they'll replicate the tone. Replicate the action. Cool. All right, so now I'm going to get you to sit on this side of the couch, and I want you to try to embody your wife. Can you figure that out? And they will. And then I'll say, okay, look at this side of the couch and try to be a good actor for a minute and say what she said. And now, not everybody can get this in the first shot, but we will play with it. Now, my goal as a therapist, I have to be a vulnerable person in the room, or this doesn't work. So that's why I'm always like very honest and blunt with people. If I feel something, I say it. If I think something, I say it. And I try my best not to hide anything. Because the goal is connection here, an embodied connection. And so as they're trying to embody their wife, you'll start to notice the barriers where they're kind of like being reserved to themselves. My job is to catch it and then see if we can play with those barriers until eventually they're able to hear it. But what ends up happening is they're able to feel their authentic response to the situation. Then we get to figure out, why did that make you sad? Why are you grieving that? Why are you hurt by that? What's coming out when you hear that? That whatever's coming out is what's missing between the communication with him and his wife. That's not for me. That's between. So the lack of intimacy in the relationship has a lot to do with the fact that they're not bonded. It's not safe. They're not connected because there's a sense of what's going on without an articulation. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, just it's interesting you say that your role as a therapist is to be the one who's vulnerable, because in many ways there's something to be questioned about sort of the desire to go to therapy these days. And I wanted to ask sort of what the desire of the analysand is. Not obviously it's going to be different for every person, but in terms of the idea of going to therapy, because that idea has been changed so much recently, and the idea that the idea of doing quote unquote doing the work, or the idea that going to therapy is itself kind of might be it not an excuse, but some people might say, I'm going to therapy, I'm working on it, so it gives you a kind of space. But of course the therapeutic room itself, I know from my experience, is good in the sense that you don't have any other space like this where you can be this vulnerable, even if it is not in the sort of the traditional way of where you'd have like a whole village full of people and like one or two of them would be your confidants, and they might not necessarily be the same person as your wife or your sexual partner. They can be different folks, or your priest and the like. And how does the therapeutic function come into it, and how do you understand the image that your clients have of you? Because that ultimately comes down to, in a way, what they want from therapy, or even if do they even want to stop being lonely? And I don't mean that in sort of the sense of like you're not working with therapy, you don't really want to get better, but more in the sense of what it might entail, certain kinds of self-transformation, even like self-abolition. Because even in a way, there's a sort of comfort in loneliness because there's a certainty to it, and that certainty is hard to get rid of. It's a vulnerability in and of itself.
Yeah, I think most of the time when people are coming in, their idea is that they need help. Like, and I use that term specifically because it's stuck most of the time. It's captured most of the time in the medical model of help. something's not working, I'm broken, I need to be fixed, is the underlying of 90% of the time what people are saying. Now, sometimes people will come in for personal growth purposes, and they'll say that. I want to be a better person. I want to be a better whatever. And so there's judgment in place. There's all this kind of stuff coming in. But the therapeutic room is often seen as a scary place to be. Like it comes in like, oh, I got to be vulnerable now. I have to be open now. Like, what am I going to find here? Is there a Pandora box we're going to open? So people are coming in most of the time scared of it and like they're coming in to be fixed. Like I'm some sort of doctor or mental mechanic, which people have joked about before. And the space is very different than that. It's not to be fixed. It is a scary place because you're coming in to be vulnerable. And for men, like just to pick up what you said about the loneliness, right? In our culture, because of this hegemonic concept, vulnerability for men specifically in these forms of relationships view the only place to be vulnerable is with their romantic partner. So the pressure of vulnerability, the pressure of this offloading is specific to one individual or multiple individuals, depending on the types of relationship people have. But they're specific and they are not to the community as a whole, right? Like with friends. So, you know, if you have a lot of the men that I work with that have like, whether it's big social structures or small social structures, the friendships are performative, meaning they're out there to like have fun, drink, go to concerts, like do stuff, not talk about things. That's reserved for one individual and one specific individual. So when they come into therapy, they now have someone else that is expecting that. So that barrier is gone because they don't have to build the connection. They have to be the connection. And so it's a very unique place to be.
Chuck, I want to get to your active imagination activity that you flagged up at the beginning of the episode. But before I do that, I think there's an important note to hit here. If we're talking about male loneliness and just loneliness in general, I think we need to address the dynamics of friendship that in 2025. I've always wanted to be one of these podcasters where I'm coming on with a bunch of statistics, and boy, do I got them today. So check this out. In 1990, if you were to poll 100 men, 3 of them would have told you that they had 0 close friends. And 40% of them would have said that they have 10 or more. And then there's a kind of gradient in between all of that. For women, it was only, it doesn't even register as a number in 1990. I think it might be 1 on this graph. But in 2021, out of 100 men, 15 of those would say that they had no close friends, and only 15 of them would say they had 10 or more, with a, various gradient in between. For women, that's 10. So basically what that says, 1 out of every 10 women that you meet on the street, one of those women doesn't have anyone that they identify with as being their close friend. For men, that's either 1 or 2. And something that's come to mind, and I just kind of thought of this on the fly here, only because I'd seen something about it online recently, but something familiar to our decade, to our internet age, is the concept of ghosting. In the past, I don't think, depending on what society you lived within and when, and, the close-knittedness of any given community, it was hard to ignore certain people. But now we live in a time where relationships online are very ephemeral. One of the things that we talked about in the episode with Richard Seymour is the speed with which we can quickly pivot away from somebody just because they made one bad tweet or something like that. Relationships, friendships, even just basic acquaintanceships don't have the kinds of roots that they once had. I was hoping that you could address the notion of friendship in the therapeutic context, especially, one thing that I see with my age mates in particular, men in particular, who get divorced and then they have nobody anymore. And, on the other end of the spectrum, of course, we have adolescents who are dealing with the Andrew Tates and Jordan Petersons of the world, struggling with the hurdle of locating their capacity for intimacy while being given all the wrong tools to find it, right? Yeah. So what's happening there with friendship? And does this this phenomenon of ghosting, does that ever appear in a therapeutic context?
Yeah, I think my take on it might be an odd one, but my take on it has a lot to do with social media. Like, I blame social media for a lot of that, because I think it was easier to maintain connection before. So it's always going to come back to connection, like bonding. But now, in order to bond, I just have to go on my tab here, press F, and then I can see my old best friend. Oh, he had a kid. That's fantastic. And then press X and walk away. Right. And I get a juice. Oh, yeah, we're connected. That felt great. And then you move on. And then you're like, hold up. I haven't actually called this dude in a decade, but I know all about his life. Like, that's so fucked up. But it's so much easier because it's a lot less vulnerable, which is risky, which is the potential for harm, potential for all these things. So that's a big piece of that, I would say. And I can talk about that for hours. The other piece is, and I'm appealing to you both, my friends in cyberspace who are close to my age. It is fucking hard to make friends. And a lot of that is, in my opinion, a lack of tools and it's all this like guilt and shame associated. It's embarrassing. There's all these affects that show up when you're going to meet someone and talk to them. Am I saying the right thing? Are they going to like me? All these pieces. And like, I talk about kids a lot because this topic right here comes up in therapy all the time, because we're all looking for connections. When you look at kids, one of the differences between kids and adults is they don't know to be ashamed of themselves. They haven't learned that yet. And they will, because this is the society of control. We control through shame and guilt. You both have talked about this a million times. We control through shame and guilt. That is the gift we were given by our Christian upbringings. And it comes out in this real discomfort that comes into building friendships, being even micro vulnerable with people. But it's just an affective response, like a defense response. It's an adaptation to shame. Kids don't have that, right? Kids go on the playground, they see Tommy picking his nose and say, oh, that's green, haha. And then they're friends for the next 10 years for some reason. Right? For us, I remember one of the first friends I made at university. It's because I walked in a room and I was so shy. And I saw this dude with long black hair wearing a Metallica t-shirt. And I was like, that's the guy. I know for a fact he's as lonely as me. I know for a fact nobody talked to this guy today because he's wearing that shirt and his hair looks like that. And I don't have hair like that because I'm not as ballsy as him. So I sat down beside him and became his friend and still friends to this day. Right? It's those type of wacky assessments that you have to do where you're finding like commonality.
This is the root of so many friendships where it's just like, oh, hi, bands. That's bands. Right. And eventually you grow up and you sort of think like, God, how does I meet that many friends just through like something so fleeting? And it's like, actually, no, it does work. And it is that embarrassing, it is that vulnerability. I mean, making friends online, I mean, online, we're advertisements for ourselves all the time, but that means that people, in a way, do connect with us, but they also, because of the way it's mediated, also in a way consume us. Like posting is also kind of a storefront, which is why you can ban people from it in the same way you're catering a storefront. Whereas it's just like in person, you'd probably have to get along with people. Like, I mean, in terms of like, I remember going to an org meeting, and and it's like we can't argue about reading lists here, like so we're here to discuss like whatever's like the current affair thing of the day. And in terms of the dynamics of friendship, yeah, it isn't more, because I think we're more connected, but it's we're more like consuming each other more and more. And then if they start putting out stuff we don't like they want to be vulnerable, or we want to be vulnerable to them, there's a risk of like saying, am I putting you off, in the same way of like, am I putting off of consumption? Like the fear of rejection is also been economically built into how we communicate with each other by design, folks. But yeah, that's definitely like operative there. Yeah,
completely. And you kind of sparked something I hadn't thought of before. When you said the word consumption, you're totally right. Like we're now being taught to consume each other. Like, like welcome to late stage cannibalism now. But that's one-sided. That is not, like, friendship is based on building the potential for shared experience, shared bonding. That's not consumption. Consumption
it's so
is one-sided.
economistic as well. It's like, you know what you want. You're a rational consumer. You need to go find people, and you might not know who you could be friends with. I mean, this is what I don't like about dating apps, because especially like Tinder, which is a lot of times you see people listing like their ethnic mixes, and I'm like, am I buying a fucking horse? Am I buying a fucking horse? No, excuse me. Am I in like a Nazi stud farm in like 1939? Excuse me. Like it's like, why are people like do like their ethnic mixes as they go around? Like, what? This is like a eugenics like market program. It's so weird. And obviously not everyone uses it that way, but it's like okay, I get it. This isn't like a connection app. This is a loneliness casino.
Yeah, that's
like the rest of these platforms. They are all like casinos of loneliness. And there's essentially like, if you don't want, the problem is that the only connection that's being offered because everyone else is also on the bloody thing. And in a way in which sort of thinking about, as you're talking about was a group therapy, it reminds me of consciousness raising sessions from the feminists in the 70s. And the deal was that would be basically the deal that the left can offer like lonely people is you won't be alone. You still be a little bit lonely on occasion, but you won't be alone. One, you won't be alone in it. Two, you might have a sort of collective power to actually like abolish the you that's lonely. And if you don't want to abolish a little bit of yourself, sort of taking that slight death drive, which you're going to do anyway if you make yourself like a debt slave to Andrew Tate. But it's in a way it's trying to offer like a collective power to smash vulnerability. The problem is so far we haven't been able to necessarily make that collective power convincing, which is like a negative feedback cycle, which is why we do need some wins on occasion. But even processing the pain of it, I think Eden, who's been on the show a couple of times, says that if you go to like an organizational meeting or even like a tenants union or any sort of community center, it's basically a place of pain, and it's that working through it together. You can say, okay, we're all like this now, and there's still something you can work through in that, although it's not as sexy as the Tate formula of you'll become an exploiter and your loneliness won't go away, but it'll mean something because other than everyone else will be, it is the maximization of this consumptive relationship because everyone else will just be, as I said, prey, and it won't matter that you're alone because you're the only thing in existence.
Yeah, and it's this like, I'm just riffing here, but this one-sided nature of connection through consumption plays right into that hand because what Andrew Tate and the other morons are offering is like a slot back into a hierarchy. So, now you feel powerful. Great. Power over. And that just feels great, doesn't it? Oh, wait. Maybe it doesn't, but it's supposed to. So maybe I'll chase that instead because I can feel something.
The issue of consumption is interesting, or framing these relationships as a form of consumption is interesting because I think it compounds the solipsism that's already ingrained within us. But not only that, even if like a new friend or a friend online, like I have people reach out to me all of the time, and I've even had content creators reach out to me and they just want to have like a quick meeting with me and like say, hey, how do you do it? I'm about to start my own podcast. I'm about to go into content creation full time. People see this now as a career vector, and I'm like, yeah, okay, let's have the chat. And I think it's funny to think of it this way, but like if I know somebody online and suddenly they're making a podcast, now they're making themselves available for a kind of consumption. So now that you can live in my head as I mow the lawn or take the trash out or whatever it is, right? And it's interesting because I'm looking at the friendship list from 1990 and 2021 here, and I can certainly identify more than 2 or 3 good friends, but at the same time, I would say that the abundance of my relationships are online interactions. People that either I've not yet met in person, like Chuck, you and I have never met in person, or maybe met one time because I was traveling through the city and we scheduled lunch at a Thai restaurant or something like that. But it's very strange days that we are living in. Yeah. With that said, Chuck, we're kind of moving towards the hour. Do you want to take us through this active imagination exercise?
Yeah, that's right. I'm really excited about this. So let me do the preamble. So the seed of this was planted in 2 ways. So the first was in our conversation that we had where you came on Couch to Couch to talk about this. And we were playing with my dream. We were walking through my dream and we were playing with, we were looking at the death figure. Oh my God, I can't remember his name, but he rides the boat across the River of Styx.
Oh, Charon.
Thank you. Thank you. And so you were helping me to understand the active imagination in Hillman, which respects the image itself. So we try not to overcode the image. We try not to add any judgments into it. And what we're trying to do is to spend time with the image to let the image like do its thing.
Sure.
Okay. So we did that for a bit and I loved it. I was like, okay, this is pretty cool. And then I was started to think like, I wonder how that would work for emotions and affects themselves. Can we play with that? Fast forward a few more months, and I started to work with an artist from Scotland. Her name is Lucy. She's fantastic. And she had hired me to help her with an art installation. She was just interviewing me and how I work, and then she was creating this art installation. And so we were talking about this, and we were talking about Eugene Genlin. Eugene Genlin was a therapist. He was a student of Carl Rogers. And what he did was he created, he got his PhD in psychology and philosophy, big into the existential philosophies, big into phenomenology, Merleau-Ponty, and that kind of stuff. And what he did was he discovered something called the felt sense, to be able to communicate with people through their felt sense. So we have, for him, you have your affect, which is the emotion itself, let's say sadness. Then you have a physical resonance of sadness. Well, let's say like a tightness in the chest or a heaviness in the chest or a hole in the stomach or something. So what Eugene Genlin did, so he was a student of Carl Rogers, and Carl Rogers, as you know from the last podcast, was all about trying to meet people where they're at with suspending all judgment as much as humanly possible. So he spent a lot of time getting to know the people and then playing it back to make sure they were heard correctly. And he did not intervene in any way ever. He just played back what people said through different forms of summaries, which I'll leave it at that because this is not about Carl Rogers. Eugene Genlin sought to do the same thing with affect, physical sensations, and felt sense. So a felt sense for him was something that would show up physically before the emotion shows up, like a gut punch or a heaviness in the chest or something like that. And what a typical session with Eugene Genlin would be to help people get into kind of like almost a meditative place, just where they can quiet their mind and focus intently on the whatever physical sensation, whatever felt sense was the loudest or most interesting. And then once they found it, they were able to like resonate with it, play with it a little bit, and then start to experience it. And now the experiencing was whatever the impulse was. If they wanted to ask you questions, if they wanted to talk about it out loud, if they wanted to communicate with him about it. It was a space where they could communicate with this felt sense directly to see what was up, if anything at all. So when I started as a therapist, I got to work with somebody who was a Genlian, and they got to walk me through this. And that's because back then, when I became a therapist, I wasn't big into the body stuff. I was very much a philosophy guy, a theory guy, and I wanted to talk about shit. So I didn't talk about the body or affect at all. And I chose this particular practicum site because they were like people who did yoga, people who did body trauma work, somatic experiencing, and this kind of stuff. So I walked right out of my element because I said, well, there's got to be something to this since it's everywhere. I know nothing about it, and I went in, which was both a nightmare and a paradise at the same time. So let's go back. There was a lot of preamble. So after the conversation with Craig, and while I was working with Lucy, I said to myself, okay, sometimes I'm working with clients who are so knee-deep in trauma work that it's actually dangerous to access the trauma in any way, or I could not find any way in, because it would re-traumatize, which is, we know now, is a no-go. No go at all. So you most of the time in trauma work, you do a bottom-up approach where you work with physical sensations and you work the way out. And for some clients, especially men, they were so divorced from their emotions or the physical sensations that there was no starting place. So I wanted to find a starting place. So what we did was I said, well, what if I treated the Eugene Genlin work with Hillman to see if I can create a line of flight and produce something that the client can work with that was just in front of them enough that it was safe and not triggering, but they could play with it. So Lucy and I got together and we tried to do it. So I have a tattoo on my arm. I'm not sure if you can see it. It is Oh, yeah. So it is a lantern. I'll send the image out. Yeah, it's a lantern busting with flames. This was the image that came out of my work with Lucy, of my own. So there's an entire history and story of my own work on my arm. So basically how this works, what I'll walk you both through, I'll just walk through kind of my experience with it and then how we do it, is we move through I'll walk you through basically the felt sense meditation, where we'll do a body scan and try to find a feeling. Once we find the feeling, and I'm going to walk you through the steps. And so for the viewers at home, I mean, play with this, but just keep in mind that it could be triggering. So disclaimer, but you can play with this in a way that's not triggering. So for clients, what I'll do is like a guided felt sense. So we'll have talked about what's going on. So it'll be on their mind. So then when they're searching for the felt sense, it will be the one that's the most interesting. But you can also just do this in general and see what comes up. So basically what you do is you resonate with whatever that felt sense is. Once you've got it, so let's say it's like a heaviness in the chest. And so you're resonating and all you can focus on is the heaviness in the chest. What you then want to do, what I'll guide you to do, is to create an image from that resonance. Mm-hmm. So you hold the resonance, you hold space for that resonance, that feeling, and see. So the trick here is, which makes it really difficult, but this is why you have to clear your mind, is to see what image develops creatively from the resonance. Okay. And if you spend enough time with it, something will show up. So when I worked with Lucy, she guided me through it. And what showed up for me was this orb. And this orb showed up and it came from, and I mentioned it, the heaviness in the chest. There was like a hole in the chest and I just focused on that and this orb showed up. And the orb had this like black smoke surrounding it. And on the inside, there was this like dancing flame. And so once you've got that resonance, you check in with yourself about the image to make sure that they resonate with the feeling. And then you have this image now. So here's where the Hillman comes in, is this image is in front of you. You get to describe it as deep as you want with your partner. And then you let whatever happen as far as questions and curiosities show up. But the idea is not to analyze the image like you're trying to help, but to treat the image as an entity in the room that you're curious about. So ask whatever questions show up. What's cool about this is the questions that show up are going to be particular to the person asking them. Like I'm therapeutically inclined. I love the psyche. I love all these things. So the questions I will ask might relate to that, depending on how I encounter the image. But then you let the image speak for itself through the person. But the key is that you let the image speak and see what happens. So when we walked through my image, it became clear as we were talking, the image would shift and start to play. And originally my question to the image was like, what is the black smoke? Does it have a smell? Does it have a touch? Does it have a feeling? Is it emanating? And as you start to play with that, it started to shift as it tried to like answer your questions and eventually turning into a lantern. And the lantern image gave me a feeling of protective rather than insidious, like the black smoke originally felt. And then, so we kind of asked questions about protection. What are you protecting from? Are you trying to keep something in, trying to keep something out? Like what's going on? Which eventually led to the flame. And where this took me, and I might get emotional when I talk about this, is from all my years of bullying and being like alone and being like a nomad, I've encountered spaces of people who had a hard time handling me. Like I was too enthusiastic, too excitable, too passionate, too all of these things. And so I'm constantly being contained by the people around me. And that is very isolating when it happens. So the story of the image would spin was that I created this containment for a spark, for a flame. And the flame is actually me. And so keeping it within the container means it can't be killed, won't be killed. And so the more I talked to Lucy about it, the more I talked to my own therapy, the more I started to get angry at the containment. And these affects started to show up until one day I was like, I'm just going to fucking break this lantern. And this was all, what I have to emphasize here is this was all like spontaneous affect that showed up as I was talking about it. I didn't even know I was mad. And I didn't even know what I was angry at. And so the image on my arm is a lantern where the flame got so hot it broke the glass. And I carry that with me now when I start to feel like I need to be contained. Then anger starts to show up and it starts to feel like, hold on a minute, I don't need to hide myself. And that's kind of like where I take that. So does that explain it?
Yeah, I think I have a fair understanding of what's going to happen here. Yeah.
Cool. All right. So I'm going to walk you through the step-by-step pieces, and then I'll walk you through it. I'll help you do it.
Okay.
So step one is going to be to clear your mind. So I have an image for that. Some of you are Zen inclined, so you already know how to do that. But the image I have in mind is you can picture your thoughts like flying books. And what you want to do is just park the books. You don't want to argue with them. You don't want to treat them badly. You want to respect them, but you want to park them into the shelves beside you. And picture your attentional energy that kind of hits the books as like a flashlight. And so instead of hitting the books, allow the books to park and shoot the flashlight straight up into your head. Once you're confident that the books are settled and that your attentional energy is focused just on the roof of your head, then point that flashlight down onto your body and let the flashlight just illuminate the body until you find an interesting or intense or loud feeling, felt sense somewhere. And once you've got it, get that flashlight on it. Just zoom right in on that feeling. And once you got it, just give me a nod so I know you've got it. All right, Craig's got one. Adam's got one. All right. So now that the flashlight, what I want you to do is get that flashlight on that felt sense and like picture that light hungry for that felt sense, just basking in it, searching through it, trying to just feel it. You're trying to intensify that felt sense as much as, turn the volume up as much as you can while keeping yourself safe. So don't let it overcome you, but intensify that feeling until you've really got a handle on it and a feel for it. And then nod once you got it. Okay. So now that you're resonating with this feeling, and it's as intense as you possibly can handle, now I want you to just sit with it, be with it, and see if an image shows up. See if something shows up. And then nod once you've got that. All right. So now you want to have the feeling and the image resonate with each other to make sure that the image is really speaking to this emotion or this felt sense. And once you're pretty clear that this image represents it really well, then nod. Okay. So now I want you to hold those images in your mind, hold them out as if, like, picture yourself like putting them on display so that we don't lose them. And then one of you are going to start and the other one's going to go. We're going to start with one at a time. where what you're going to do is to describe that image so that the rest of us can like really feel that resonance, see it, picture it. And then we'll move to the next one and start to play with them.
Shall I go first?
Whoever wants to.
All right. Okay. All right. So I'll just give you a narrative description of like what happened.
Okay.
There. Okay. So I saw all the books fly back on the shelf, and I had no problem imagining the flashlight shining up onto my head. And I have pretty pasty skin unless I have a little bit of a tan. So when the light came back on my body, I noticed I was completely hairless, which was odd. I didn't feel any pain sensations or any like sort of warmth, but as the light went up to my head, it's almost as if there was we'll say like a 20 by 20 metal sheet just impaled through my head, perfect square, like right at the middle of my nose. Like almost, so imagine like I was underwater and I poked my eyes up just to the bridge of my nose to like see above the water. Well, I'm walking around naked with a metal sheet, like I said, maybe 20 inches by 20 inches, just kind of flopping around there. The kind of sheet that you would, maybe the same consistency and thickness of metal that you would use if you're trying to make the sound of thunder, right? Like that sort of thing. And then the light, there was a disparity between like the lightness and darkness between that part of my head and the rest of my body. Then once you asked me to sit with the image, the camera eye immediately pulled back, and I was just kind of sitting with that metal sheet in my head. And I noticed that the metal started to turn organic, and the metal that was in front of my head and to the side of my head started to become part of my head. But I realized I was shape-shifting into a woolly mammoth. And now hair was just fucking like pouring out of my neck and my head. And it was just absurd. And I started laughing because I saw this emergent power, which just seemed like, whoa, this is going to be pretty crazy. This is going to be pretty forceful, guys. And then I just saw this mammoth stepping out of my neck. And as the activity was breaking off, I just saw the first foot come out of my neck and leave the husk of my body behind. And there was a sense in which I can't attribute it to like a felt sense. I felt a nostalgia beyond nostalgia. It was almost like a desire to be prehistoric, whatever that meant. And so it made me feel the kind of ill sentiment that we have towards humanity. Like we killed off the mammoths, even though that might not be true. Like it felt like the human killed the mammoth, but now the mammoth is fucking back. And we're going to have this prehistoric feeling, whether you like it or not. And that's kind of where the image ended.
That's powerful. The minute you said,
I want to emphasize how funny it was. Not like it wasn't laugh out loud funny. It's like, what the fuck is going on here? Like I didn't feel sad or anything. It was just kind of like kind of laughing along with it. Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, hold on to that.
All right.
And then Adam.
Yeah, I'm not as good at active imagination as I believe I review art. I mean, I was just sort of focusing on just the flash ended up just on my jaw and a kind of tension in my jaw. Then the more I was focusing on that tension, the more I ended up sort of clenching it to try and focus on it. And then the only image that really came to mind really was just a frantic image of an eyeball surrounded by a sort of red fleshy mass that was just constantly darting back and forth. And then this eye moved into both, it appeared in the pit of my stomach, but for some reason I imagined as Glastonbury Grove, that kind of pool of black liquid from Twin Peaks. And then the eye moved up into like a cavity in my jaw. And I was like, okay, this is just, to me, this is Resident Evil shit. But it's clear, like, the internal monitoring, like, I'm not sticking with the image, but the image is basically, like, yeah, frantically looking all around myself. In a way, I was imagining my own process of trying to find an imagining. So I ended up having to imagine myself frantically looking around myself from the very tension in the parts of which is the stomach and the jaw where it felt most intense.
So we have this seeking, like, so I'm gonna just like, so this is the point where we spontaneously come up with shit, like what we're feeling, we say it. Okay, so both instances, I had this like feeling when you were talking of, like, I gravitated towards the spontaneous feeling that showed up as the images were producing themselves.
Right.
So in Adam's case, it was the frantic feeling. It was this sense of franticness that kind of showed up. And for Craig, it was like the fucking mammoth, this prehistoric feeling. But there was so much affect behind like how you said that. So my gut is really curious about the movement there. So I want to respect the image, so I don't want to lose that. But my gut was like, what did frantic feel like? And what helped me feel frantic and feel prehistoric?
Gosh, how would I help you feel like, so you would want me to help you feel prehistoric by articulating the image further or explaining it or delving
however deeper. Like I'd like, because there was so much energy there that my body, like, if you noticed, I got really excited on both sides. Like I got excitement showed up, so I immediately gravitate towards that movement.
I mean, here's what comes to mind. In my case, feeling like there was an apparent absurdity. So here's what comes to mind. Seeing that metal sheet in my head wasn't surprising. I think I'm a fairly imaginative person, and it was like almost like, oh, here we are again. Just another one of these situations, par for the course. Like, what's on the docket today? Metal sheet in the head. Okay, I think there's a precedent for this. You know, there's a bit of that, and so that kind of made me laugh. I would say it's surprising in a way that a mammoth or an elephant appeared, because maybe my spirit animal is not a mammoth. I don't know. I'm more into like hawks and wolves and that kind of shit. So to see something as large and magnanimous as a mammoth appear is kind of fun and interesting. And to know that like, in order for that image to have been revealed, one of the preconditions for that was backing up the lens of the image itself. So in order to see that transformation take place, a shift had to occur. And I have to say too that there was a problem with the optics to a certain extent. And even imagining, like, I couldn't take in the full angle of the metal sheet in my head. Like the camera was just kind of panning around to like to see what it was. But then when I backed out, I could see everything. And the emergence of the beast from my body made short work of this husk that is my human skin. And that was just kind of flopped on the floor as it faded to black.
So here's my active imagination question. If you're spending time with the mammoth now, and you're getting to see them in all its glory, what is the mammoth's take on being seen like this?
The mammoth's take on being seen. Well, the mammoth would say something like this. Okay, now we're getting somewhere, because he's thinking like, look, I have this incredible power, capacity, but not only that, ability to be nurtured. And, you know, you see these things that are lodged within your body, or these apparent aberrations. You know, it's kind of funny. It is kind of comical, right? But I want to let you know that there's more to it than just a simple irony. There's a great power here. And also there's something to be nurtured. And there's been something that's been forgotten. I mean, maybe that's the prehistoric aspect of it, right? Is that we can, you know, in the case of seeing my body as having this, plate lodged in my head, to me, it appeared funny. Like maybe I wasn't going to take the activity as serious. And so the mammoth would say like, look, that's where I came from, man. You know, that's a point of origin. And that, you know, of course it can be funny, but it's much more than that.
And what I'm getting is he's kind of chastising you, but I don't know if that's how are you receiving that?
Yeah, maybe it feels a bit aggrieved, I guess, or it feels like it was inconvenienced by my mere amusement. Like it was showtime, man. And you spent time with something so trivial. You forgot that is what was holding me back. Right? You let that thing lodged dead center and then in the horizontal medium of your head. And it was essentially a cap, right? And I laughed at the cap.
And then we're faced with the majesty of a woolly fucking mammoth.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And it almost seemed, well, now looking back, it's like, well, this late arrival, that's on you, man. You know, so there is a sense of guilt there too, I think, in the image.
Is that, and this is a straight psychotherapy question, is that how you're relating to it? Like, is that when he chastised you, is that what you felt?
I would say with respect to the question, yes. With respect to the appearance, it was more shock and awe.
Shock and awe.
Yeah.
All right, Adam, do you have any questions for the mammoth? Or Craig's and the mammoth?
I mean, the mammoth makes sense to me, you know, because, you know,
well, Adam
he's a big guy, you know, you know, we were talking about, you know, before we start recording, like weightlifting, you know, it makes me think of like, and Craig talking about how much he just loves like lifting weights. I was like, yeah, it's the heaviest thing you can think of. It's gone, but it's also it carries itself by lifting huge weights. It's completely synchronized with that. I mean, I can imagine sort of the man was saying, so, you know, what else would you expect? You know, it's one of the things that retrospectively makes sense.
Craig, odd question. What is the mammoth's reaction to Adam?
The mammoth's reaction to Adam is like, oh, that's a typical Adam reaction. That's as much as I would expect from him.
Yeah.
But
you mean to tell me the mammoth has Adam pegged?
Yeah, the mammoth does have Adam pegged, but he cares about Adam. I care about Adam, and the mammoth cares about Adam. So the mammoth has nothing but good things to say about a lot of people, and recognizes folks' foibles and recognizes, you know, their idiosyncrasies, but also has limited patience, right, for a kind of reservation or triviality.
Okay, Adam, your turn. So, frantic was the feeling I got during this whole thing. Frantic. And there's also a feeling of like, whoa. As you were describing it, I was getting this like crawly feeling over my skin. Like, oh, fuck, there's eyes everywhere and they're frantically trying to. But it sounds like they really want it to be lodged in your jaw. It sounds like there's like an intention, an aim. Am I right about that or no?
Yeah, it's interesting. The more sort of, as you folks talk, I just sort of sat with the image a little bit and sort of tried looking at it in the eye, the respect to the image in the eye itself. Because previously it was like it's just moving all over the body, sort of like literally frantically looking everywhere, darting everywhere, being like, let's find something to say. And then when I looked at it in the eye, it stopped being sort of like a skinless mass of flesh around the central eye and sort of turned into something that looked a bit more friendly, and also wasn't moving. It sort of looked directly at me, and I'm like, okay. So it became sort of like, I don't know, maybe something regarding the fear of recognition, or the fear of, I don't know, being caught out, not having the best active imagination thing. Yeah, I know. Yeah, this is my subconscious is trying to win therapy. That's what happened.
What I like about it is the meta paranoia. It's already a paranoid image, but there's a paranoia about the paranoid image. Is what I really appreciate. Yeah,
it's the problem. I write most books in a paranoid style.
Well, I'm going to take us out of the exercise for a minute. I love the fact that the two of you had two different reactions to this, because these are the two different reactions I get in therapy. Some people, and Adam, because we're not in therapy, I'm not going to like pry to figure this out, but some people are so divorced from their like physical sensations and noticing the physical manifestations of affect that they have a really hard time finding that felt sense. So then it becomes like a performative switch of like, fuck, the therapist wants something, it needs something, I gotta find something, right? Which is great. Like, that is fantastic, because we can play with that, which we didn't get to today. We can if you're open to it, but we can start to figure out what's going on here.
Yeah.
Well, I was great at therapy. I was just like, oh yeah, see this. I know this is Freud, isn't it? Yes, this is Jung too. Oh yeah, have you had this guy Bataille? I ended up teaching my fucking therapist Bataille, because like to try and fill the void in the silence rather. And sometimes you just sit there silently. So like sort of so, okay, maybe try and experiment with silence a bit. You know.
I mean, one thing I noticed right away once we started interrogating the image, especially in the context of this trio, is that it made a certain form of disclosure easier. right? Like now, like suddenly I'm saying things about Adam, and I'm speaking through the voice of the mammoth and that sort of thing. And I know that's a strategy that therapists will employ in some manner or another, like, almost like a role play, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe similarly to Adam, is I had a certain trepidation of like, oh gosh, what if something comes from deep out of the well that's just dark and ugly, like that kind of thing. But I guess my question would be, what do you think the role of like surprise is in this case?
I think the role of surprise is one of the most important, because you're encountering, oh man, this is so funny. So a year ago, I would have said you're encountering a part of yourself that you've never seen before. But now, because of desiring production, I'm now thinking that something is being created over the encounter itself.
Yeah.
So you're having an opportunity to be vulnerable with yourself, and now something is showing up.
Mm-hmm.
So like, I mean, think about how I just said that. Surprise is a part of that.
Yeah.
Right? Fear is also a part of that. Because it's like, what am I going to find? Right? Or what is going to get produced for me? So I'm not shocked by those, but now it's beginning to make way more sense to me, this whole concept of creative production. Because then when you're thinking about the mammoth, the eye, right, the lantern, these are how I'm relating to the moment and how I'm opening myself up to having those relations like express itself. Kind of like when you meet someone, which is kind of why I love this technique so much. Is if I'm going out there, I'm at a coffee shop, and like something that I like to practice because of just being socially anxious and trying to move away from that, is that I'll meet random people now a lot. I do it all the time. I'll be at a coffee shop and somebody's like looking at their phone or whatever, and I'll come up and I'll just say something. Like the other day I said, how about the price of eggs? Right? And we just laughed about that because I was like, I know, worst opener ever. Thank God I'm not dating anymore. Right? And we were able to laugh about it. We're just like having a conversation. It was like 10 minutes. What's cool is you're able to do that with yourself through these images, right? And so for some clients that I've worked with, when it comes to trauma, right? So these images are coming from how they're being produced, from how they're relating to their trauma, not from how, but when they relate to these sensations, images are produced. And then what you're able to do with those images have a direct correlation to how the trauma healing or adaptation goes, right? In some instances you can, I don't know, take that image, like the lantern, right? I took that image and now I carry it with me so that when I get those typical triggers, like my body produces an affect that's typical to a freeze or a fawning, if we talk in survival adaptation terms, I know that what's happening now is I'm trying to contain myself. I'm trying to hide. And I know that I'm trying to hide because that's a lot safer than when someone's trying to shush me or quiet me or contain me. Right? So now when that affect shows up, I'll sometimes will rub the forearm. You've probably seen me do it today a couple of times. And that's when I'm feeling particularly vulnerable and I know I want to hide. But I also know that I very much want to be here. I love it. I love this conversation, right? And so I'm able to use it that way. Kind of like, oh yeah, wait. My flame is supposed to be outside the lantern. I am an excitable person, a passionate person. It's not my job to worry about if other people like that or not. It's their job to stay or leave, which is fine, kind of thing.
Okay. See, now the eye is frantically looking around.
How the fuck am I supposed to close this?
The voice is to close this. It's that image that ends up sort of, I think, I might start seeing it now whenever sort of meet a new person, because they're kind of just frantically going like, what do I say? What do I say? It's basically kind of, it's part of the subjectivity of social media. As far as, if I tried to write myself out, that it didn't work. It's just like, okay, don't go away. Don't leave this. You're almost like you're selling yourself. Don't leave the store kind of thing. Which is awful, especially if in content creation, because it's just saying you're making content out of yourself. You're like making like, I don't know, fucking, God, what's it called? Soylent Green. That's it.
Yeah, that's right.
You're making Soylent Green of the soul. And of course, if we want to purchase our Soylent Greens of the souls, our recorded selves, our digital afterlives, our new flesh, even as we put out all these exercises to try and understand these images better. Of course, folks, you can find Chuck's work over at Couch to Couch. I believe you have a website as well.
Yeah, my website is therapyformen.ca and www.ksrc.ca. So I work out of two places. But therapyformen.ca is my personal work and my stuff on that side, and then I work out of a center in Kemptville.
See, folks, we have to look after our blokes, otherwise they're going to turn into fascists, and we don't want to have to shoot the blokes. You know, we got to look after the blokes, otherwise someone else that will. Well, not really will. They'll have a little carrot and stick situation. But regardless, Chuck, thank you so much for joining us on this rare inner experience version of Acid Horizon, which means we get the cool synthwave stinger.
Oh yeah, that's right. Fuck, I love that music.
Inner experience.